today I'm psyched. I'm stoked. I got my man, the myth, the legend. He is the cosmic Indiana Jones, and I like to call him a good friend now because we have done several interviews with him, and this is really a treat, an honor, and a privilege to be able to interview you in person. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to go back to the ancient past, and what I love about your books is it's like a story. You have many books. It seems like it's 1,000 books, it seems like. And you cover it all. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. Each one connects the dot. You do that so perfectly well, and I think you do that better than any other researcher, hands down.
Well, thank you.
So, but when I got here, I was in the room because at the hotel room, and I was changing and everything, and on the TV, my wife was watching the prince getting married or whatever. They had a documentary, a docu-movie, whatever they call them, on. They had Prince Charles in there. This is right when I was heading out the door. Right when I was heading out the door, Prince Charles in the movie said he brought their kids to Africa right after Princess Diana died. As soon as I walked out the door, it caught my eye. He said, "This is Africa, the birthplace of humanity." I'm paraphrasing a little bit. I think that's exactly what he stated. Now, what do you think, Joseph?
Well, the standard genetic thinking right now is that humanity does come from Africa and that it migrated from basically Central Eastern Africa up through Europe, out into Asia, and so on and so forth. And the typical dating that they give for some of these genetic haplogroups that they've been tracing, they use very sophisticated computer algorithm programs to divide up humanity in terms of haplogroups that are based on mitochondrial DNA, the female DNA. And they've basically traced this back now to approximately 150,000 years ago, when they think modern mitochondrial human DNA arose, and it arose in Africa. The interesting problem there is that they have discovered what they call mitochondrial Eve. In other words, they've been able to more or less make a very good case that all of humanity ultimately comes from some common mother, in that the mitochondrial DNA in all humans appears to be the same. The problem is that they've discovered the same thing about what they call Y chromosomal Adam. And Y chromosomal Adam is about 100,000 years older than mitochondrial Eve. So, this presents a little problem. They're not talking much about it, but what interested me about it was when I did the book Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I compared what they were talking about in terms of the haplogroups of human females to the ancient texts, where in the Sumerian tradition, in the Mesopotamian tradition, you basically get the idea that there were 14 female donors to this big, grand genetic engineering project that you discover in those texts, and one male donor from, quote unquote, the gods that jumpstart modern humanity into existence. And if that's the case, the geneticists kind of in a roundabout way have kind of corroborated that ancient story, because of course the gods, that come down, they lower kingship from heaven and all of that in those texts. The gods are obviously older than modern man. But the other thing that's very interesting about that story is that genetically, if that project is to have any hope of success, we would have to be genetically similar to whoever it is that's coming down. And I find that very interesting because I talk about many times in different interviews, I talk about our genetic cousins. And if you look at some of the cylinder seals and so on from that area of the world, they portray kings, the Lugal A, which, is their term for a king. That means quite literally the large man or the big man. So a king seated on his throne in those ancient cylinder scripts is portrayed in a very large fashion. And then you have these tiny little humans bringing little offerings or gifts or whatever to this, big king. And of course, the standard academic response is, well, they're just portraying this metaphorically. They're portraying the king as huge stature to portray his political status. But, the way I look at it is that's little evidence for giants. So, as far as I'm concerned, we're looking at little confirmations here and there if you take those ancient texts seriously. But, there's a big problem in terms of the dating of mankind just genetically. You add to this some of the archaeological evidence that people like Cremo and Thompson have unearthed in Forbidden Archaeology, which is a book I highly recommend people read.
What do you think about that, Joseph? Do you think that we go that far back? Because I believe he says hundreds of thousands of years, or possibly even a million.
Well,
maybe?
This is what I was getting to. We tend to think of humanity as Homo sapiens sapiens, in other words, the species that we are now. But we forget that Homo sapiens sapiens is part of the bigger genus Homo sapiens, which is part of an even bigger phylum or family called Homo. So in other words, the way I think that we have to look at it is we may have cousins out there that are very similar in appearance to us, very similar to us in terms of genetic makeup. And that sounds crazy, but when you compare it to some of their archaeological data, one of the things that I pointed out in the Cosmic War was they discovered a coin that had been discovered in, I believe it was southern Illinois, in stratigraphy that would have dated it to approximately 250,000 years ago, which is right about the time, if you take the genetic information I mentioned earlier, mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam being about 250,000 years ago, that coin is from approximately that time period. Well, this coin is very unique in that it was milled. In other words, it went through a mill press, like a modern coin.
I think I've seen that coin.
Yeah. It's very peculiar looking. It's got writing on it. It's obviously worn, being so old.
I will put that coin up for the audience to look at that within this video.
Yeah, it's a bizarre thing, and that's just one little example of some of the things that they found. They found kind of oblong, oval-like steel tubing in chalk mines in France that's very, very old. They found those little metal spheres in South Africa in stratigraphy that would have been about 1 billion years old, and it's clearly machine stuff. So in other words, there is evidence out there that somebody here that was intelligent, that was technologically capable, producing these things. All of this has been basically suppressed from the record. So, their title is very apt, Forbidden Archaeology. We I think, go back a very long way. And let me throw in a little UFO story here, too. Well, in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I did an analysis of a lot of the Cooper-Cantwell set of the Magic 12 documents. And there's one document in particular, one statement in one of those documents that struck me as being one of the most profound things in that set of documents. And I'm not concerned really with their authenticity or lack thereof. I'm concerned with the information in them, because the information in them, like it or not, has to be coming from somebody on the inside. There's too much good information. There's a lot of disinformation. But this statement was made in the aftermath of Roswell and the supposed recovery of extraterrestrial bodies. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not in the Roswell ET camp of things. But this statement is so striking because what it said was, after examining this evidence, they had come to the conclusion that the humanoid life form was apparently part of some higher order biology and physics in the universe. In other words, what they're saying is that if there is an evolutionary path to intelligent life, it's going to produce something like us, which is very, very odd. I mean, to be making that statement in 1947 is way ahead of the game. They're starting to talk in a very similar fashion now, and doing so in the mainstream. But in 1947, that's not that's not something that you're going to get a Harvard PhD in biology saying.
That's truly sci-fi.
That's truly sci-fi back then. So you've got all these little clues out there, and I think they kind of add up to Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sapiens, but Homo sapiens, the humanoid intelligent life form, may be much, much older than we give credit to.
And so we were talking about academia, and
I prefer to call it quackademia.
Okay, let's use quackademia. Let's use that. So how come quackademia? How come it seems like they're not ready to accept the alternative explanation of our ancient past? Because what are they afraid of, Joseph? Because it seems like they are not ready to rewrite history. I definitely think that they are afraid of something.
Well, I don't think, by and large, most academics I don't think are afraid. I think they're just following what they consider to be good academic practice. In other words, they might acknowledge the existence of such evidence, but they have difficulty creating a comprehensive model to explain it. Some of them, I think, probably are afraid, because the more you get into this and the more you open your mind to it, you realize that the current model of, we were hunting and gathering for tens of thousands of years, and all of a sudden we decide to invent mathematics, music, calendars, domestication, agriculture, political organization, and on it goes. Once you look at that narrative with unjaundiced, unskeptical eyes, you realize there's a big problem with it, and they haven't really got any alternative. And the problem also, I think, that they're faced with is that in order to entertain alternatives, they have to start entertaining things that make them very uncomfortable. Atlantis, ancient high civilizations, and on it goes. This has just recently changed this year, because there was an article in Scientific American that was published. And basically the paper was, well, if there was an ancient civilization that was technologically sophisticated and industrialized, how did we detect it? And, that's quite a sea change. I think what it represents is kind of a limited hangout. The amount of evidence has grown so much that they are having difficulty now simply ignoring it. So they have to start getting their tentacles into it in order to maintain their control of the narrative. That's my best guess.
And let's go a little bit further back, Joseph. Back to when I stated with the origins that Prince Philip stated in that little documentary movie that I was watching, or as soon as I walked out the door, talking about Africa being the origins of humanity. But how do you believe life was, out of all your research? You have tons of books. Out of all your research and knowledge, how do you believe life was seated here on Earth, Joseph? Are you subscriber to Zecharia Sitchin's work?
No. Sitchin, yes and no. Sitchin's a difficult case. I'll put all the cards on the table. I'm very sympathetic to the modern theoretical physics view called the anthropic cosmological principle. In other words, physicists are coming to the conclusion, and serious physicists, I'm not talking about fringe people, Frank Tipler wrote a book for the University Press of Oxford University about the anthropic cosmological principle. And basically they're coming to the view that increasingly it's difficult to ignore the physics evidence that suggests that the universe was created for intelligent observers to emerge. So in other words, there is an inbuilt, for want of a better expression, there's kind of an inbuilt theosophical or theistic principle. And I don't mean theosophical in the sense of Madame Blavatsky, but kind of a philosophical theistic principle involved. Now, physicists themselves would dispute that assessment of things. I want to be very clear about that, but this ultimately is what they're saying. So, I don't want people to get me wrong when I say that there was some sort of genetic engineering at some point that seems to be indicated by ancient texts that, I disbelieve in God. That's not the case. Yeah. But I do think that when you turn to people like Sitchin's a problem because on the one hand, he raises a lot of very good general points. Namely, that if you take these ancient texts at their word and compare them to some of the findings of modern science, what you're looking at are ancient descriptions in the best language they had available to them of scientific processes. But it's when you look at Sitchin's details that I part company. For example, he wants to view everything in terms of nuclear weapons and rockets. And I'm getting a very different physics when I look at those ancient texts from nuclear weapons and rockets. Rockets, first of all, as we're finding out now, rockets aren't going to mine asteroids. They're not going to get us to Mars or back. So we have to have a different technology. And slowly, we've been watching the trickle and the drip of more and more information that they're coming out with, Lockheed's fusion reactor, the EM drive for NASA. DARPA wants a 100-year warp drive project for the United States. Mm-hmm. All this bizarre stuff that sounds like science fiction. But what that's really telling you is, yeah, we know rockets aren't going to be able to do this. Even von Braun knew that. So, I part company with Sitchin on the details of his scenario. The other problem with Sitchin that many academics have raised is that his translations are tendentious in many cases. And so when I examine those ancient texts, I avoid the academic out of claiming, well, it's a translational error. This is trust me here, I'm a patristics guy, so when academics run out of arguments, they always turn to the translation argument. And there are problems with translation in Sitchin. So when I look at those texts, I use academic translations in order to look at those texts and say, well, don't blame me. This is not Sitchin translating it. This is Stephanie Daly, very credentialed, very qualified, And you get a different view of things when you look at some of those texts in those translations.
So do you think that we are a product of panspermia, or do you think that maybe this is kind of something I think about every now and then, that maybe life, possibly somehow primitive life here on Earth, either dinosaurs or whatever, Neanderthal, eventually was a product of panspermia or something like that.
Some seeding operation?
And then there was an intervention in the far ancient past.
Okay, those are two different questions. I do think there's evidence of seeding of life here on this planet. And this is kind of a convoluted answer, and I'm going to have to go around Harvey's barn to explain it. That's my mother's expression, by the way. The Zulu tribe in Africa has as a tribal legend that they came to this planet from Mars on a Merkaba, which I find is very interesting because that's a Hebrew word. What are the Zulus doing with a Hebrew word in their vocabulary? But a Merkaba in Hebrew means a ship. And why would the Zulus of all peoples on the planet have this idea that no, we originated off planet? And I think the Dogon tribe in Africa has a similar sort of legend of some sort of off-planet origin. But the long and short of it is if you look at these tribal legends and square them to the traditions around the world that we have of the flood, all of those traditions say that this flood was something universal. The problem geologically is if you look at all the planets in the solar system for evidence of a planetary-wide flood, it ain't on Earth. Guess where it is?
Space.
Mars. Mars. Because if you look at the geological evidence of Mars, it looks like one whole half of that planet was just smacked with gobs of water.
Mm-hmm.
At some time in its past, which explains a lot of things, like the fact that it doesn't have much of a magnetosphere anymore, that the atmosphere was just ripped off, that half of the planet looks like it was just scoured, and the other half looks like a debris field. So there's a lot of evidence for viewing the flood as something that may have happened on Mars. Put that with your tribal traditions, and what do you get? So I entertain the possibility that some form of humanity may have come here from somewhere else. Again, that squares with those tales of Nephilim in the Bible and Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian texts and so on. But in terms of life itself being seeded here, there's been just this last week a paper, serious paper, again, submitted by scientists looking at octopuses, which, octopuses are one of my favorite animals because these things are incredibly intelligent creatures.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, they don't live very long, or we might be in trouble.
Alien in nature.
Yeah, and that's what this paper says. These things maybe have come here from off planet somewhere. They were seeded here. If that's the case, again, it puts that whole evolutionary explanation for the origin of cephalopods into a cocked hat, because supposedly that divergence between the half of the evolutionary tree that leads to humanity and the half that leads to the modern octopus, I think, is about 850 million years ago by their best reckoning. So now we have scientists saying, oh no, this whole thing may have been seeded here from somewhere else, which would explain their very bizarre makeup, a central brain and then a brain in each arm, and it's all connected, and, so you've got that, that's just come out. And again, I'm thinking that these papers are being released because there's some sort of sea change that they're recognizing, that they can't maintain the current narrative in its current form. Mm-hmm. Dinosaurs is interesting because there is in Christian theology the idea of a gap theory of creation. This was kind of the plaything of 19th century evangelicals who noticed that there's a parallel verse to the opening verses of Genesis, I think in Jeremiah or Isaiah, where apparently the earth was created and then it was kind of deformed, and that there was a second remake or a reset that wiped out the dinosaurs and created mammals. I've never subscribed to that theory, but it's out there. I think eventually you're going to see some attempt by scholars to pull all of this information together and create a new model, a new paradigm. And that's what I think a lot of these scientists are trying to jump in now, because they're trying to reassert control over this narrative. I think again, the alternative research community has put so much pressure on some of those standard narratives that it's forcing some reassessment of these things. So where in 10 years we're going to end up, I don't know.
All right, just a while ago you were talking about Mars,
mm-hmm.
and you got my mind go around in circles. Like it's going in all directions here, and what I'm thinking, Joseph, is what if because you talk about the breakaway civilization. I know that was Richard Dolan's coined term, the breakaway civilization, but your research into that is very phenomenal. And what people talk, many other researchers talk about the Mars-Earth connection. So what if there was already a breakaway civilization? What if it was the Mars breakaway civilization that came to Earth? Because you were talking about the flood. Those were actually on Mars. What if those were written? The tradition, the verbal whatever, was actually from Mars. But all of these stories of that, maybe in the Old Testament and things like that, and that nature, what if a lot of this is maybe possibly from Mars, and whatever kind of cataclysmic event happened, they broke away and seeded life here on Earth. And then my theory is they landed all over the world. That's why we have pyramids everywhere, not just in Egypt. And we have these monolithic monuments everywhere. And maybe I would call these different gods that landed all over the world. You call them generals, gods, or whatever. And when they landed, I guess you can say maybe the life was already here on Earth. And this is maybe where the intervention came in, and they, like in Genesis 1:26, I believe it is, let us make God in our image, or let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Tell me what you think about this. This Mars breakaway civilization that came here, created life, and those are actually our gods that actually broke away.
Well, my scenario is a bit different. In my book, The Cosmic War, and my operative model, and again, I'm putting out hypotheses. This may be shown wrong. It may be amended, altered. So this is not something I'm holding with an iron fist. This is the truth, and you got to accept it. But my model has always been that there was indeed a very high civilization here on Earth and elsewhere in our solar system. In other words, I think that we have been operating with an unexamined assumption, in the sense that we have, insofar as we've entertained that idea, we've limited it to planet Earth. I think it very possible that civilization was interplanetary. And my model has been that it blew itself up, quite literally, in a war. This is the part of the story that frustrates me, because the alternative research community doesn't want to go there. It does not want to view these wars as actual wars, but metaphors for catastrophes and so on and so forth, which I think mutilates the text too much. So my model has always been it blew itself apart in a war, and the war was fought with horrendously sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. In my model, those weapons were used to blow up a planet in the solar system, which is now the asteroid belt. But part of that model has been that, let's say right now, the insane neocons running this country and many others that have nuclear weapons, France, Great Britain, go down the list, we get into a nuclear war and we blow ourselves up. Well, I'm not one of those that believes that this would be the end of humanity, but it would certainly be the end of civilization. Einstein's quote, if there's a World War IV, then it's just bouncing the rubble, so it'll be fought with sticks and clubs. But anyway, my assumption has always been that this civilization would have had continuity of government operations. It would have had surviving elites. And those elites, in the aftermath of such a war, are confronted with the problem. The problem is not just how to survive, but how to jumpstart civilization again. And this is where it gets very interesting. If you're going to jumpstart civilization, if you're going to have civilization, what do you have to have? You have to have commerce. And in order to have commerce, what do you have to have? You have to have a uniform system of weights and measures. So what do you see during the megalithic period all over the world? You have these structures being built that, if you examine them, they appear to embody geodetic and astronomical units of measure. Now, why is that crucially important to this model? It's crucially important because forget the old academic saw that you learned in high school and college that, they were basing units of measure on body parts. If that's the case, there's no standard of measure. It's going to be different from place to place. So an astronomical and geodetically based system of measure is going to be the same for everybody because you're basing it on more or less universally known phenomena. So I think the megalithic period, when you see structures like Stonehenge, Aylesbury, some of the henges in France and so on and so forth, I think this is an indicator that you have an elite at work all over the world building these structures to enshrine units of measure. And the other thing that they're going to do is they're going to attempt to pass down their scientific knowledge in such a fashion that that knowledge is not going to be lost in the transmission. And secondly, that it's going to become apparent when humanity achieves a certain pitch of development scientifically to decipher those myths and understand that they encode scientific information, that this is what you're going to do. You're going to create myths that embody a scientific concept or concepts that you can easily hand down and that are going to be transmittable over several generations. They've done studies of the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and it's astounding how much information has been preserved without much alteration. So forget that old, saw of whispering in someone's ear, and you pass it around, and it turns out at the end of the passing to be completely jumbled from what it started. I've run that experiment, and I've seen it where the information is passed almost perfectly. So it can be done. This is what I think has also happened. Look at books like Hamlet's Mill, Van Degent and Santayana, George de Santayana, where they document very conclusively that these ancient myths are preserving a definite scientific knowledge and astronomical knowledge. So again, my model is, there's a breakaway civilization, but the civilization broke away because it had to. It was a surviving elite or elites from that war.
The rich get the ticket.
The rich get the ticket, and they have to jumpstart things in a hurry. And this is what I think has happened. So in other words, my model is almost completely different than the standard academic model. In other words, I'm not assuming we're hunting and gathering for hundreds of thousands of years and all of a sudden we decide to invent Sumer for no good reason. Their own textual statements, Sumer, Egypt in particular, the very earliest texts in Egypt indicate that they themselves think of themselves not as a peak of civilization, but as a declined legacy of something that preceded it. So again, we're not listening to what they themselves are really telling us. And the story they're telling us is something very different. There's these breakaway civilizations, but they broke away because of catastrophe. And if you put the war into it, well, the war created the necessity to do this. So my model is a bit different. Where the Mars flood part fits in is if you look at the work of Dr. Tom Van Flandern, the old Naval Observatory astronomer. He published a book, Dark Matter, Missing Planets and New Comets, in which he outlined his revision or revival of the old 19th century exploded planet hypothesis. And that basically was a bunch of astronomers in the 19th century using a harmonic law that they had figured out to predict the orbits of the planets. Well, that law predicted there should be a planet in the asteroid belt that wasn't there. So they went looking for it, and that's when they started to discover the asteroids, and then they realized, well, these aren't planets, these are just small chunks of rock. So they came up with the idea, well, there was a planet there and it exploded. Well, Van Flandern revived that hypothesis in the last century, in the 20th century. And his argument is to me, is priceless, because he's trying to figure out, well, why would a planet explode?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen that often. And he comes up with a bunch of models, and this is what really got me on the cosmic war idea. The first model he proposed was that there was a nuclear reactor in the core of the planet that exploded. It went critical, and kaboom.
They made movies.
And they made movies, yeah. And they made movies about
yes.
Star Wars,
Mm-hmm.
a galaxy far, far away. And like I put it in my second book, in this crazy series I've been writing, it's not far away in space, it's far away in time. It's right here, but long ago,
Exactly.
And Lucas is giving us all of these hints and clues. And let's remember, George Lucas is being advised by who? He's being advised by Joseph Campbell, who is, the world famous multicultural mythologist who, is aware of these exploding planet myths from various human mythologies. So Van Flandern moves along to his second hypothesis. Well, maybe he knows that a fission reaction is probably not going to be sufficient to blow up a planet. So his next idea is, well, maybe there was a bunch of antimatter in the core of that planet that was somehow contained, and then the containment broke down and kablooey. And again, you can tell he's not happy with that one. He's grasping for explanations.
Maybe they had their own CERN project.
Well, hang on. And then he finally comes, and I even quote this in the Cosmic War, because you can tell that he doesn't want to go there, but he knows this is really the only explanation for it. He says, well, it may have been some sort of advanced technology that just went wrong. Or maybe it was the result, he says, of deliberate action. And those were his words. In other words, a war. And I'll press a button, blow up the planet. And I thought, okay, that's pretty interesting. You've got a scientist here that's coming right up to the precipice, but he doesn't want to say the W word. And I think, it's very clear from the text. You've got the gigantomachy in Greek mythology, the war with the giants, the war with what? Saturn. Kronos is the Greek word for Saturn. You've got in the entire Sumerian literature the Enuma Elish, which academics, I love this, academics say that, well, this is a creation epic. Bull roar, sit down and read the dang thing, folks. And, I defy anybody to read any of it, particularly the fourth tablet of it, and come to any conclusion other than this is a war epic. That's what it is. It's not a creation epic. The creation's already there. They're fighting. So yeah, you've got these cosmic war traditions, and I think you have to take them seriously. And if you're going to blow up a planet, let's get back to Mars. As I told you, I was going to go around Harvey's barn. Well, Van Flandern speculated that Mars may have been a moon of that larger planet. And that larger planet was water-bearing. And when it blew up, what happens? Well, it sends a shock wave of what? Water. It hits one side of Mars, which is what the geological record shows, strips that planet bare. The shock wave continues throughout the solar system. It probably hits Earth, accounting for the flood stories here and so on and so forth. But yeah, whatever may have been on Mars is going to be in a bad way. And the closest planet to them that you can get to that would be capable of sustaining life after a catastrophe like that is Earth. So Zulus, Dogon, ancient texts, breakaway civilizations, there you go.
And maybe this, because maybe Charles Fort had it right. And because he talked about, I believe, fish falling from the sky, right?
Yes.
Well, what if that was actually from that, instead of actually here on Earth? I don't want to get too much.
No. Fort is giving you a clue, because there is a Babylonian tradition of the fish god. You ever heard of this? The fish god, Oannes, that comes up out of the ocean and teaches, apparently this fish could talk. Teaches all the little monkeys, that, namely us, that he's discovering. Well, why don't you create a civilization here? So yeah, that could be fish from the sky. Yeah, could be. Now, Fort was talking in terms of water spouts sucking up fish, and air currents keeping them up there, and then they get dumped. But Fort also says very peculiar things too, like, I think we're property. And somebody out there,
I agree.
somebody out there has a stake or a claim on us, So, he wasn't stupid. And I think in some cases he probably hedged his words, because he was already ridiculous enough for that day.
I love it, though. He would have been my best friend back then.
Oh, yeah, me too. Me
too. Back to Mars. And you talk about this, and a few other researchers also, that Cairo is Al-Qaira, which means literally place or camp of Mars.
Yes.
Place or camp of Mars? What does that say? So they broke away and they landed. One group landed in Cairo. Some strange similarities there, Joseph.
Very, very, very odd things that you encounter when you get into this. Little indicators that there's a much deeper story. Egypt itself called itself Alchemet. Alchemy. Transmutation of matter. Alchemet. You get
Toth probably made up that word.
It's Tehuta. Tehuta. It's pronounced Tehuta. It's like Hebrew. You have to fill in the vowels. But Tehuta, is another one of these very strange characters in history. There's other little indicators. The Arabic Islamic tradition of the Sphinx calls the Sphinx the father of terrors. So in other words, I part company from the Jonquils and Daisies crowd that, this is all a big golden age and all we have to do is get back to it. No, the big golden age blew itself up. And, part of the world is maintaining that idea that, ancient history wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Plato, Atlantis was a warlike culture and so on and so forth. So, I've just taken that model and run with it, I guess.
So Michael Tellinger talks about this and other researchers as well. You may know what I'm kind of getting towards. Do you think we were created as a slave species?
Yes and no. I don't think God created us to be a slave species. Image and likeness of God does not connote slave species. And in fact, the Old Testament statement, you're to have dominion here, which doesn't mean go around slaughtering animals, but it means take care of this place. This is your garden. This is your home. So that doesn't connote a slave species. But I do think that every tradition that deals with this subject, particularly the Judeo-Christian, does indicate that the fall of man enslaved him to processes of thought, to habits of action that essentially are not part of the original scheme of things. And in that sense, man becomes a slave to these habits. There's a very famous statement in St. Maximus the Confessor that mankind fell into, this is so insightful, fell into dialectic. In other words, a way of binary thinking, either or. Everything is opposed to its opposite, and so on and so forth. So it becomes kind of a habitual pattern of thought for mankind at that point. So yeah, in that sense, somebody or something came along and messed everything up. In the Islamic tradition, Iblis, Satan, the Satan figure, is jealous of the creation of mankind and so sets out to ruin it.
Kind of speaking of war, and we're talking about the gods and the ancient past, why does it seem like the God of the Old Testament is a war-fearing, doom and gloom type of God?
Oh boy. Yeah.
You don't have to give me your clip notes.
No.
However you want.
I wrote a book with my friend Dr. Scott DeHart on that called Yahweh the Two-Faced God, because it is clear that if you look at the character of Yahweh in the first 5 books of Moses, objectively, without the religious programming, it is very bloodthirsty.
Is this I don't mean to cut you off. Is this the same God? Before you get into that explanation, is this the same God that created us in His image, after our likeness?
Well, the Gnostics would say no, and their whole point was this moral difficulty with the character of Yahweh. And quite frankly, I had that same moral character. I had that same difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
They would say no, but Christian orthodoxy would say yes. And the reason why it would say yes is that it does not identify the person of the Trinity in the Old Testament with the Father. It identifies the person of the Trinity revealed in the Old Testament with Christ. Mm. Now, there are various reasons why they say that, and they're very good and profound reasons why they say that, but at the same time, that locks them into having to defend the character of Yahweh. This is why the disputes in the first 3 to 4 centuries of the history of the church with Gnosticism are so long and drawn out and intense, because that moral problem is never really, in my opinion, adequately addressed. So I think you have to do, and again, this is my opinion, I'm going to get in trouble with lots of Christian scholars out there, but
you have thousands of followers, though.
Well, I would hope not followers. I would hope people that are thinking for themselves in terms of all of this. I think you have to be open to the possibility that there's got to be a fundamental rethink of a lot of these things. And it's going on. It's taking place in the alternative community, although in ways that itself are very problematical, and that's part of the problem. I think ultimately we're going to discover that Christianity's roots owe much more to Egypt than they do to Judaism.
All right, Joseph, you were just talking about that Christianity will finally catch up to terms that its origins and everything are more Egyptian than anything. Right. Explain a little bit more on that, because that is very intriguing, and I totally agree.
I've been dropping lots of clues in various books. And it's important for people to know that I write my books, and started out writing them with the very deliberate intention that they were all dovetailing with each other and in a particular order. So it may seem like that order is very haphazard, but it's been very deliberate. I have about 4 or 5 books ahead of what I'm actually writing, where I want to go. So yeah, I'm telling a big story. You can read the books in any order that you want, but they were conceived in a particular order. But they all do kind of interface with each other. Mm-hmm. But, no one wants to sit down and read, a book that's that thick. No one would do it, so that's why all the books. But plus, I don't want to write a book that, it'd take me forever. But it's much easier to break it up. Yeah, Egypt, I've been dropping a lot of clues. And, biblical scholarship has, in terms of New Testament criticism, has for a very long time been maintaining that there are connections between St. John the Baptist, between our Lord and the Essene community. Well, it's now come out, and I wrote about this in Thrice Great Hermetica. A British scholar by the name of Richard Feather documented a connection, very odd connection, having to deal with the Treasure Scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the Essene community, to Egypt and to the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Mm. So, that says a lot right there. And there's a lot of other stuff I could say. If you really sit down and read Josephus very carefully, you'll discover all sorts of allusions to Egypt. It's very, very peculiar. And I'll give a hint here. Josephus calls Christ in many places the Egyptian. That's his code for Christ. So sit down and read those passages in Josephus, and things will probably start popping out. And then final clue is just remember who Josephus might be. And that's a clue for people who know.
Very interesting.
And I'll tell you that off the air.
Okay. Now, let's go a little bit back within the next few minutes for this segment. Who is winning this war, Joseph? Because
who's winning?
Who's winning? Because
I don't know.
Because well, what I'm getting at is, it seems like, I guess, which of the ETs are winning this war and have dominion of Earth? Because it seems like the bad ETs are pretty much calling the shots. Why I say that, if it's the case, I'm just saying.
If the bad ETs were calling all of the shots, or if demons were calling all of the shots.
It's a lot of evil in the world.
If the international Jewish Masonic communist banking Freemason, all of the crazy conspiracy theories out there, if they were really calling all the shots, things would be much worse than they are now.
I agree that on that aspect, which I'm an open book on just pretty much everything. I leave everything open. But why is there so much evil and violence over the past several thousand years?
Well, let me flip the question. Theodicy is an interesting question. The theist has to explain why there's so much evil. The materialist, atheist, agnostic camp has to explain why there's so much beauty and good.
Good point.
It's
fair.
The two things are related. As for who's winning,
because you do talk about the cosmic war,
right? And
it feels like it's almost maybe still going on, maybe.
Oh yeah.
And we are going to get more into the secret space program and breakaway later on.
Yeah, I think in
other segments.
Yeah, I think it is still going on in a very subtle way. Many of them subtle ways, I should say. Many of them spiritual, many of them more overt. But I think it's still going on. It's very difficult when you go back and look at those ancient myths to decide if it was the good guys who won that war or if it was the bad guys who won that war. In essence, the war was so devastating that neither one won. They ended up destroying each other pretty much. And that's why I think elites from both sides survive, which is why it's so very difficult in the record to decide who's doing this, what side of the moral coin are they on? Because in that kind of situation, where you are literally having to jumpstart humanity. Think of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove at the very end of the movie, when they're blowing each other up and they're going to have to figure out how to survive. Well, there's a brief period where, the Americans and the Russians are, oh, we've done it now, what are we going to do? And all of a sudden they decide, well, we're going to have to cooperate, but that soon breaks down.
Yeah.
Well, I think something similar, if this cosmic war hypothesis is true, I think something similar has to happen. You're going to have surviving elites, and they're going to be making common cause every now and then just to get things done. It's going to be like, Don Corleone cooperating with, the other Dons to get certain things done, even though they're enemies. So they meet at their table, they smoke their cigars, they kiss each other's rings, they have their brandy, and they have their copy out on the street shooting at each other. But here we're going to figure out how we're going to press forward and go forward. I think that's kind of the situation you're dealing with throughout history. You've got both sides vying for power. The problem now is technology is unifying the world, and so Mr. Global is in the end game. But the problem is Mr. Global is not a monolithic entity. It's several factions, and they all want to be in control and on top. And whenever that happens, you have perfect tailor-made situation for factional infighting. So that's what I think is going on. As to who the good guys are, I think the good guys are quite literally the people that are caught in the middle. It's you and me and everybody else trying to make sense of this. Hopefully, doing so with good intention, good action, and if you're the praying sort, prayers and so on and so forth.
And before we get more into the breakaway civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Define your definition. I know Richard Dolan has his, but do you have your own?
Mine is exactly his. I think he came up with such a profound idea based on all of that research he did in the 2-volume study, UFOs in the National Security State.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I think people have to understand that what he's doing when he mentions this concept is giving his best conclusion at that point of the state of his research. So in other words, he's not just coming up with a hypothesis he's tossing out there. He's coming up with an actual assessment of what he's seen. And basically his idea is that the national security complex, in examining the problem of UFOs, created an infrastructure and research program that over time, with enough money and so on, basically began to pull far ahead in terms of its scientific capabilities, pull far ahead of the public civilization that you and I are part of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been surviving as kind of a parasite on the host. In other words, it's using the host's money, the host's human labor, human capital to pursue these projects, and yet has created a situation where its technology, and this is so important because Dolan says breakaway civilization. He doesn't say breakaway group. He doesn't say faction. He says civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And a civilization is a culture. It's an assumed matrix of knowledge and patterns of action that are based on that knowledge. And that knowledge in this case is a very sophisticated science. So this means it's going to affect the way it views the world. It's a cosmology he's getting at. It's going to affect the way it views the world, how it interacts with the world, where it wants to take the world, and so on. All of this is implied in his phraseology. And I think it's very important that we understand it that way, because if you look at the covert projects infrastructure in this country, in the old Soviet Union, in Europe, and so on, if you look at it, what it is a civilization. It has its own infrastructure, it has its own transportation, it has its own commerce, and it has borders with the public civilization, the classification, the checkpoints, where you get access to these facilities. So in other words, it has all the trappings of a civilization. And therefore, it may even be its own separate kind of rogue government. And this is precisely what I think we're looking at, and why it's so difficult to look at how it's affecting things, because it's not part of most people's thinking. But when you add in missing money in the trillions of dollars now for several decades,
yep.
If that trillions of dollars were in the, so to speak, the financial circuitry, it would have, and this is where the economic models, the standard models break down. They've been predicting, because of this, hyperinflation for a number of years. It has not shown up. Why? The only answer is it's going somewhere else that's not part of this visible economic circuitry. It's part of the electricity, in other words, that's going to a completely hidden load end of the system.
Mm-hmm.
So where's that system? So yeah, I think once you entertain the idea of a breakaway civilization with those kinds of capabilities, it begins to make sense of a lot of the news that you're seeing, but makes sense in a way that any standard analysis cannot, because it's missing, like Catherine Fitz says, it's missing 50% of the picture.
Mm-hmm. Now,
ask yourself this question. Germany, our wonderful ally Germany, has recently, that's the old Tom Lehrer song. I don't know if you know who Tom Lehrer is, but he was a satirist back in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. And he wrote these satirical political songs. And at the time, Henry Kissinger had proposed, well, let's give nuclear weapons to Germany. He wrote a song about, we've got our traditional allies like Britain and France, our good old friends, the Germans, who've hardly bothered us since 1918, but anyway, well, recently, about a month ago, some German company, a telecommunications company, said that they wanted to build out a 4G network on the moon. Why?
Yeah.
Why do you need a telephone network on the moon? And they're serious about it. This is just, we're going to do this now.
Wow.
Well, what that's telling me is that money, some of that missing money, is going up there.
Exactly.
In space.
Do you think, and we're definitely going to get into more of that.
Yeah, I know.
Into the further segments. But before we get into that later, part of this, I guess, do you think this breakaway group and the players behind, do you think that these players and this missing money, trillions, do you think that is part of some of the underground tunnels and bases that are...
Oh, sure, absolutely. Think about how much tunnels and underground bases $21 trillion would buy you.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's really talk finances. During the 2008 bailout hearings, remember the derivatives crisis, which has dropped right off the radar, interestingly enough. The derivatives at that time were estimated, I think, to be, if memory serves me correctly, between $14 and $17 quadrillion. Now, this is orders of magnitude more than the gross domestic product of the entire planet. Now, let's pretend we're Venetian bankers on the Rialto. And our ledger says we're in the red here to the tune of $14 quadrillion. What are you going to do with all that bad paper? Why is that there? Why the mortgage on the entire planet? Now, after that, isn't it interesting that they've started talking about asteroid mining? And on one of these asteroids alone, they've estimated, oh golly, it's in the quadrillions of dollars. Perfect way to balance those books.